Good evening. Your favourite London-based media outfit is 48 hours away from going into Tier 3. We won't make too big a deal out of it because I know many of our viewers will have been in this tier for the previous 2 weeks, and it's also unrelated to why we went on late. We weren't stockpiling or anything like that. But we are coming to terms with this new information. Ash, how are you feeling? The pubs are going to be closed from Wednesday at midnight.
Well, that's why I was late to start. I was, down my local getting my last substantial meal in, while I still can.
We are going to be talking about London's move into Tier 3, of course, today, and much of the South East. We are also going to be talking about whether or not schools should close in the last week before Christmas. I mean, I think they should, and I'm not someone who has been arguing that they should have been closed this whole term, but I do think now, absolutely. We're going to talk about Brexit with James Meadway, then a story about Keir Starmer on LBC, Jeremy Corbyn starting a new foundation, and one more story which I've forgotten, so that can be your surprise. I'll work it out in a little bit. Before we do that, can I get you to share the show link? We want more people watching this live, and tweet on the hashtag #TyskySour with your thoughts about whatever I'm talking about on tonight's show. Matt Hancock today spoke in Parliament to confirm he would be shifting much of London and the South East into Tier 3. We'll speak about that in detail in one moment. But first of all, he premised his announcement with this worrying-sounding revelation.
First, I'd like to update the House on a new development about the virus itself. Over the last few days, thanks to our world-class genomic capability in the UK, we have identified a new variant of coronavirus which may be associated with the faster spread in the southeast of England. Initial analysis suggests that this variant is growing faster than the existing variants. We've currently identified over 1,000 cases with this variant, predominantly in the south of England, although cases have been identified in nearly 60 different local authority areas, and numbers are increasing rapidly. Similar variants have been identified in other countries over the last few months. We've notified the World Health Organization about this new variant, and Public Health England is working hard to continue its expert analysis at Porton Down. Mr. Speaker, I must stress at this point that there is currently nothing to suggest that this variant is more likely to cause serious disease, and the latest clinical advice is that it's highly unlikely that this mutation would fail to respond to a vaccine. But it shows we've got to be vigilant and follow the rules, and everyone needs to take personal responsibility not to spread this virus.
Now, that was a slightly odd announcement, but apologies. That was a slightly odd announcement because new strains and sort of mutations happen quite regularly. He also, as he said, hasn't said that this would make it more deadly, more dangerous, or that it would make it more resistant to a vaccine. So I think there's been some consternation among scientists that Matt Hancock has sort of generated this very scary sounding headline without really telling us what is meaningful about what he has just said. Two options potentially. He wants to scare us because he thinks everyone's got a little bit complacent, or he wants to distract from the fact that the government's policy is clearly failing. They've had to put London into Tier 3 2 days before they were supposed to be reviewing the tier system. So it's not looking good. Maybe he's looking for a new scary headline. He has got it. So congratulations on that. Anyway, let's go to the key changes which were announced today.
Hospitals across the capital, Essex and Kent, are already under pressure, and we know that this doubling of cases will be mirrored in hospital admissions, and it only takes a few doublings for the NHS to be overwhelmed. Our NHS is straining every sinew to cope with the pressures, as they always do, but if cases continue to double, even they will be overwhelmed. So we must act now to shift the curve, because when the virus is growing exponentially, there is not a moment to spare. We're therefore acting ahead of the formal review date. I'm very grateful to colleagues at Public Health England, NHS Test and Trace, and the Joint Biosecurity Centre, whose surveillance of this virus means that we can act very rapidly when a problem arises. We've therefore decided to move Greater London, the south and west of Essex, which includes Basildon, Brentwood, Harlow, Epping Forest, Castle Point, Rochford, Malden, Braintree and Chelmsford, along with Thurrock and Southend-on-Sea borough councils, and the south of Hertfordshire, which means Broxbourne, Hertsmere, Watford, and the Three Rivers Local Authority, into Tier 3, which is the very high alert level.
So Tier 3 restrictions, as many of you will already know, mean that all non-essential shops will be closed, as will pubs and restaurants, except for takeaways. Now, it comes after cases in London have rocketed over the last few days. You can get up a graphic from the BBC now, which is showing quite how severe that increase has been just in the last couple of days. So you can see, especially the past 3 days, it has been absolutely rocketing. Havering in London has the highest levels in the capital at about 506 per 100,000 people. And I think we can go next to a graphic which shows how severe the epidemic is in London compared to other regions which went into Tier 3 when the lockdown that we had in autumn ended. So you can see here that when new tiers came into effect on December the 12th, London and Manchester actually had the same level of coronavirus. Now London is rocketing up. I mean, this only goes up to December the 7th, so it will be going much higher. And so London is in a much more severe stage of the epidemic than many regions which went into tier 3 2 weeks ago. Now, Dr. Jenny Harris, she is the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, told MPs today that in some hotspots in the capital, cases were doubling every 5 to 7 days. That's the same rate as was happening in the first wave of the pandemic, obviously to disastrous effects. Tier 3 doesn't affect schools, but with the Christmas break days away, many have taken matters into their own hands. So schools in Greenwich are closing from this evening, so they're closing 4 days early for the holidays. That's so families can act to get on top of COVID before Christmas. Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, thinks all of London's schools should follow suit.
Schools can't be made COVID safe. If the government can't provide community testing for these schools, the government needs to provide urgent clarity and guidance to those schools. And if those schools can't have the mass testing this week, those schools should close down a few days early. And if it's the case, it takes a few more days in January to get these schools with the testing they need, then maybe these schools open a few days later in January. What we've got to make sure happens is that our schools are COVID safe. Nobody wants schools closed down unnecessarily, but also nobody should want these schools to be places where the virus is spreading rapidly and into the rest of the community as well.
Now, that's clearly an eminently reasonable idea. I think the fact that we have currently a very severe epidemic in London, people are about to meet their grandparents, as they've been told is fine by the government, in less than 2 weeks. And we still have people going into areas which we know are hotbeds of transmission. Now, I've said previously, even though schools and secondary schools do seem to be hotbeds of transmission, there's a very difficult decision to be made. I don't think it would necessarily have been preferable for kids to be staying at home over the past term. So there are difficult decisions. But when it comes to 4 days of school, when, as the government have suggested, you were going to have kids meeting up with people from older generations, it just seems like an absolute no-brainer that schools should be shutting early. And not only are the government refusing to back that call, but they are actively threatening schools with legal action if they take the initiative themselves. This is infuriating. And when I read this story, I was outraged, right? So this is a Guardian report from the weekend showing that Nick Gibb, who is the schools minister, has written to a head teacher in Hertfordshire threatening to use the Coronavirus Act to impose an injunction on the school if they close early. So using really authoritarian legal action to say you cannot possibly do this. Now, I want to go to some quotes from the head teacher because I think this just sort of really emphasises how reasonable this school leader is trying to be. So he says, "We've had nearly 50 positive cases since September and a significant outbreak in one year group," said the head teacher, Matthew Warren. "There is no chance in the last week of term that we're not going to have cases." On Tuesday last week, 170 staff and children, including half the English department, were off school self-isolating. Warren said he and his senior team were now dreading having to call parents, particularly of younger pupils, to tell them their child would have to avoid all contact with anybody else on Christmas Day. Warren had been keen to ensure his pupils did not have to endure this separation during the festive season. For mental health, hearts and minds, we felt it wasn't fair, and parents supported us overwhelmingly. Now, this is just so reasonable. He sounds like a very sensitive, caring guy. That policy, again, is a complete no-brainer. Give them 4 days off so they don't have to self-isolate on Christmas Day, which is a possibility if they're in school right up until this Thursday. In response, last Wednesday, the day before the school planned to close, Gibb, so that's the schools minister, we can get up the second bunch of quotes. Fox. Gibb wrote a letter to Warren stating he was minded to direct the Board of Trustees to keep the school gates open and had the power to do this under Schedule 17 of the Coronavirus Act. Refusal to comply would have allowed the Department for Education to first direct the Board of Trustees and then seek a court injunction requiring the school to provide face-to-face lessons according to legal advice Warren received. So in the head teacher, we can't defend that. It's not a good use of public funds, which we're desperate for. So the result there, you've had a head teacher who's been intimidated into leaving his school open until the end of the year. And this just to me is mind-blowing. So there was a head teacher who was willing to do something very reasonable. All the parents were supportive because the parents don't want, their kids to be at risk of catching COVID-19 just for 3 extra days of school when they are about to meet older generations, as the government have said is okay. A head teacher's trying to do something reasonable. The parents are happy about it. The kids are happy about it, and the government come in with this really overbearing threat of legal action, which means that the reasonable outcome can't happen. Again, this is another issue which is putting Britain out of step with its peers. So Germany, a country which has dealt consistently far better with coronavirus than ourselves, has already announced a lockdown, including schools from this Wednesday. So from Wednesday the 10th. So from this Wednesday until the 10th of January. And they're closing all shops across the country. And that's to make sure that when they have their loosening for Christmas, they're having one as well. It doesn't lead to the kind of mass death that is potential, which is potentially going to follow the Christmas we're having, because the government seem to be so lackadaisical when it comes to restrictions before their 5-day free-for-all. It seems to me just to be, I suppose, dogmatic stubbornness. It seems like the government have made it their commitment that they're going to leave schools open. They're not going to close schools. And so even though it's just 3 days of education and the result of closing schools could be incredibly beneficial. I mean, I think you speak to the public about this, they're going to say close them 3 days early. That's what their head teacher said about parents at their school. It seems so obvious to me. What's also, and this obviously brings back memories for myself about the March lockdown, when you had countries like Germany who were going ahead of the UK. And again in September, when you had the government who were being told by scientists that actually telling everyone to go back to work and back to school at exactly the same time is probably a mistake. When they said you should have a two-week circuit breaker over half term, they said no. It seems like the government are making all the same mistakes again, which is to take action very late, which means that action has to be taken for longer. And that is the same here, because I hadn't really considered this until I watched the Andrew Marr show on Sunday, which is that not only will us having a very lax Christmas without a lockdown beforehand, not only will that cause more deaths in January, but it will also mean that this whole pandemic lasts longer, and that's because it will intervene in the inoculation of the population with a new vaccine. And this was laid out by Sarah Gilbert, who is the lead researcher on the Oxford vaccine, as I said, on Andrew Marr on Sunday.
So I find wearing a mask frustrating. I want to shake hands with people. Will I be getting rid of my mask and shaking hands again by the spring or the summer, do you think?
It's going to take time to get back to normal. And I think actually people's behaviour in the coming weeks is going to have a big impact on that. What we've seen in the US is that after Thanksgiving, when people were travelling and mixing, there's now been a big surge in infections, and they're seeing 3,000 deaths a day now, highest rate that there's ever been in any country. If we have that kind of thing happening over the Christmas holidays in this country with very high transmission rates than possible in January, it's going to take so much longer to get things back to normal, because partly all the vaccination clinics will be disrupted. Yeah. It's not possible to run vaccination clinics when staff are off sick and there's a very high transmission rate affecting people's ability to come to be vaccinated. So I think what we do over the next few weeks is really going to have a big impact on how long it's going to take to get back to the normal. Hopefully we could be more or less back to normal by the summer, but that's not going to be possible if we're starting from a very bad position in January.
So that's a really important point that I hadn't considered, because when I'd been thinking about the relationship between the vaccine and any lockdown now or restrictions now, what I'd been thinking is, why would you allow there to be more deaths in January when the most vulnerable people will be vaccinated by March? It seems like we should just, hold out until we're actually all safe from this virus. What I hadn't realized was that actually if we let more people die in January, then that will not only mean that people die before they get the vaccine, but that the vaccine will get rolled out much later. And as Sarah Gilbert is explaining there, that's because the NHS is going to be completely clogged up dealing with the number of people going into hospitals and going into critical care to be able to successfully roll out the vaccine. So it just seems self-defeating on so many levels. I finally want to bring up Stephen Riker, who is a member of the SAGE subcommittee on behavioural modelling. I thought this was very interesting, what he tweeted on the weekend about the Christmas break. So he says, it is now clear that the free household bubble policy for Christmas was a mistake. It has increased the proportion of people planning to meet from 1 in 6 to 2 in 5. Still a minority, but even with these levels of mixing, there will be a surge of infections in the new year. The problem is that the policy and the way it was communicated gave people the impression that it is safe to mix when it plainly isn't. You mix at your peril and the peril of your family and your community. You endanger their health and you risk overwhelming the NHS. Now, this is something we've talked about before on this show. The argument that the government gave for having a loosening of restrictions over Christmas, and it's a sensible one, is that people might break them anyway. We can't really stop people doing something that they feel so passionate about. Some people really need a break. And therefore, we don't want to criminalise doing something which many consider normal and fine, which in many cases it is normal and fine. I should be clear there. But in announcing this 5-day break, they didn't say, look, we absolutely advise you not to have unnecessary contact. We don't think it's a good idea for people to meet their grandparents or their older parents, but we don't want to criminalise it over these 5 days. So what we're doing is we're absolutely not saying, let's encourage you to meet up with your family. But we are saying for these 5 days, we're kind of saying it's up to you. It's your responsibility. No, the government, when they announced it, said, let's have a great Christmas. You've got government ministers who are going on television saying that they're going to be hanging out with their elderly parents-in-law. That was George Eustace. We showed that clip before. So they have basically set an example and set the tone, which is to say, for those 5 days, the rules don't apply. Go knock yourself out, have a good Christmas. And I can't see a possible way that doesn't lead to quite a lot of deaths in January. And as we've heard from Dr. Sarah Gilbert, the extension of this pandemic. Ash, I want to bring you in now. I think you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Amazing.
Sorry, I had some technical difficulties earlier.
You weren't just blanking me.
Yeah, that was the difficulty. I didn't want to be here.
I want your thoughts on London going into tier 3, but also how it is that the government seems to be making exactly the same mistakes that they made in March and then in September all over again, which is to act too late and too little, and I presume to have more deaths in January and a much longer lockdown than we would otherwise need.
Well, these two things are related. So London wasn't put into tier 3, even though many boroughs had an infection rate and a risk of the NHS being overwhelmed, which was comparable to other parts of the UK, which had been put into tier 3 when we came out of that second to lockdown too furious thing, which ended on December the 2nd. So there were bits of London where it was really quite clear that the direction of travel in terms of caseload was not good, and it didn't make sense for it to be in tier 2, really. What you then had was a kind of tacit encouragement of people get festive, they mix, they take more public transport, they go to pubs, restaurants, even though it's outdoors. There's a kind of generalized feeling that lots of people aren't being quite so stringent or adhering to the rules like they once were. And in a place like London, where you do have these hotspots in early December, that's essentially just a carte blanche for the virus to spread. We know how it spreads. Tier 2 restrictions, also, remember, by the way, weren't supposed to be a blank check to go do what you want. Tier 2 restrictions were supposed to severely inhibit the spread of the virus and stop the need for having to go into tier 3. So something's gone plainly very, very wrong there with the government's strategy in the first place. I also think that the government has been led by kind of wishful thinking at every step of the way. So you go back to March when we were so late to go into lockdown, it's because the government was entertaining the wishful thought that Britain was so different from every other country that it wouldn't have to go into a lockdown, that it wasn't authoritarian like, Far Eastern countries, and it wasn't going to be the kind of, disaster as we looked at it then. As what we saw in Italy in terms of those exceptionally high death rates. We ended up exceeding those death rates. We ended up having a much worse financial hit than countries which had a much stricter and shorter lockdown. And when it came to Christmas, the government had this idea, I think, that Boris Johnson was never going to be the man who told you that your family couldn't get together on Christmas Day. That was priority one. It wasn't actually about the preservation of life. It wasn't safety. It was Boris Johnson is not going to be the prime minister who cancels Christmas. And then rather than thinking about how you actually facilitate that level of social mixing over a period of, say, 5 days, it's going to be indoors. People are going to be hugging. It's going to be contaminated surfaces, people sharing food, all of that stuff. Thinking about, well, where are the trade-offs going to be? Is the trade-off going to be in schools, a space where, kids aren't really socially distanced. They're not wearing masks in classrooms. We know that, secondary school aged people are some of the, biggest vectors of infection. They're really driving those rates up. Are we going to do anything about schools? No, they're going to stay open. Okay, fair enough. There are really good arguments in favour of that. Are we going to do anything about the hospitality sector, particularly in London? No, it would be too expensive to prop it up. So that has to stay open too. And so there was no area where there was going to be a real sense of, well, this is going to be where we, have restrictions which will inhibit the virus enough to make this thing that we really want to happen, i.e. Christmas, a possibility. And the same approach was taken to reopening schools in September. There are really strong arguments against keeping schools closed even during the pandemic in terms of not just kids' education, but their well-being, kids who are at risk as well. There are really, really strong arguments there. But rather than saying, okay, well, absolutely everything else in society will be under some level of tighter restriction in order to facilitate the reopening of schools. It was, no, let's just do everything at once. So it's hard to feel any faith in the government making wise decisions based on the data that it has available to it. What it does is that it takes the, headline that it would like to have. Boris Johnson saves Christmas. Boris Johnson says kids back in school, and then works backwards from there. Right, and thinks that you can have all these things at once. It's absurd.
I mean, there are so many terrible decisions that this government has made, but I really do think that when we look back on this pandemic, that the government announced both on the same day that on the 4th of December we were going to, loosen the lockdown, let people go about their normal lives to a large extent, and also on the 23rd of December we're going to have a 5-day free-for-all where the restrictions don't really apply. That combination of policy announcements was crazy. There's absolutely no justification for that whatsoever. It should have been one or the other. They should have said, look, okay, we'll go into looser restrictions, but that means you don't get to have a normal Christmas, or we're going to keep those restrictions in place precisely so you can have a normal Christmas. What they did is, as you say, they were just purely optimistic, irrationally so, and now we are left in this incredibly dangerous situation, which was entirely avoidable. We'll be talking about this a lot over the next week. We are going to talk about the other big issue of the day, which is Brexit now. Before we do that, if you are enjoying the show, please do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, or a little Christmas bonus, I suppose. That would always be very much appreciated. If you are already a supporter, thank you so much. As you already know, you make this organisation possible. You make this show possible. So we are very grateful and appreciative of your support. Yesterday was supposed to be the deadline for the UK and EU to reach an agreement on their future trading relationship. No one was especially surprised when that deadline was missed and the timescale for negotiations was extended. This is Ursula von der Leyen speaking at the European Commission yesterday.
Our negotiation teams have been working day and night over the recent days. And despite the exhaustion after almost 1 year of negotiations, and despite the fact that deadlines have been missed over and over, we both think that it is responsible at this point in time to go the extra mile. We have accordingly mandated our negotiators to continue the talks and to see whether an agreement can be reached even at this late stage. The negotiations continue here in Brussels. Thank you so much.
So von der Leyen's statement was, and I suppose other things she said that day, was read as more positive than pronouncements which had been made in the previous week. Johnson then pushed back against any suggestion that a deal was in the bag.
Look, if Ursula's optimistic, then that's great, because as far as I can see, there are some serious and very, very, very difficult issues that currently separate the UK from the EU, and the best thing to do now for everybody is to follow up all the work that's been done over the last 4.5 years. Colossal amount of preparation at our ports everywhere across the UK. Get ready to trade on WTO terms, and there is a clarity and a simplicity in that approach that has its own advantages. It's not where we wanted to get to, but if we have to end up with that solution, the UK is more than prepared.
Now, anyone who watched Friday's show will know that I think this is basically all a performance. They're taking it down to the wire to increase the drama so that Boris Johnson can sell this deal domestically, and our press corps are playing along. But I'm not going to rehearse that argument again. What I want to focus on today is that all of this this focus on the negotiations like it is a sport, because I suppose, Laura Kuenssberg, Robert Peston, they love the drama, means that one thing we're not scrutinising is what's actually going to be in the deal. Now, I think a deal is very likely, and we have not really discussed, no one in the media is really discussing what's going to be in it because of the focus on this binary discussion between deal or no deal, where any deal is going to ultimately be seen as a success for Boris Johnson by our media establishment that don't really think being critical of the Prime Minister is a particularly useful thing to do with their time, even if they are political editors. Now, the implications of any deal, that's what I want to talk about today, is obviously, this too wonky for me, too wonky for Ash. We do politics, we can't do policy. So, on the line, I have economics and policy guru James Medway. How's it going?
Hello. Not too bad,
I actually
thank you.
just saw, I should have asked this before we went live, but there was a sort of debate about how you pronounce your name on Twitter a couple of days ago. It's found its way to my timeline. Is it Meadway or Medway?
It is Meadway.
It is Meadway.
So
I do always get it wrong. Wow, that's quite embarrassing. Apologies for that. Anyway,
that's fine.
Yeah, I wanted to get you on. To moving away from the binary of deal or no deal. What's actually being, and I know that because I've seen your Twitter feed, I know that you're similar to myself, think that a deal is overwhelmingly likely. What is being decided about what will be in the contents of that deal that matters to us, that will affect our lives, that will affect sort of the economic model that Britain ultimately operates on over the years and decades to come?
Well, almost all of it will affect us in some form or another. The bit that probably would have the least immediate impact on us is perhaps, unless you actually work in the fishing industry, which very few people in Britain actually do, is the sticking point in negotiations, we're told, which is the issue of fish and Britain leaving the common fisheries policy, and therefore what kind of access do in particular EU fishing boats get to Britain's sort of territorial waters as usually defined under international law. This is held up as the big sticking point in the negotiations. It's probably there bluntly as a negotiating instrument by the British government as much as anything else. I mean, I hate to break it to people, but if push comes to shove, I suspect the British government care more about very much the City of London, but that's kind of settled by this point, and certainly the car industry, than they do about the fishing industry for all the sort of noise that they make about this. There are a few marginal seats in Scotland and elsewhere that perhaps have some political influence on this, but bluntly, I don't think the Conservative Party really cares that much about what happens to our fishing industry relative to every other consideration. So my guess is that this is being held up as a sort of negotiating ploy to rinse as much as possible on the thing they do care about, which is these so-called level playing field changes. And that's the bit that basically says the EU would like, Britain would like the fullest possible access to the EU's markets, and it'd like to have the minimal cost doing so in accessing those markets. The EU then says, that's fine. If you want this access, you have to abide by our rules and regulations, including rules that say we're not going to sneakily undercut you and dump cheap goods inside of Europe and cut taxes massively for whatever it is we want to cut taxes for over here. This is the issue that sometimes we talk about around state aid, and this is where the level playing field negotiations come in. So that's the sticking point of this. And really the entirety of the negotiation that probably really matters is the degree to which Britain gets out of those level playing field negotiations without also being threatened with tariffs on the other side. That's one part of it. The other bit is this issue of a ratchet clause, as it's been helpfully labelled over here, which is the idea that the EU can say, okay, we've agreed now, but in the future we might change our regulations. We want to make sure that Britain keeps pace with that and doesn't undercut them sneakily and dump stuff in our markets and all the rest of it. That's the EU's point of view. From the British government's point of view, they say, no, we want to be able to set whatever regulations we feel like, particularly in things like data, and all these sort of exciting new industries that they believe they can now try and get into. That's the status of negotiation. The basic issue for this where we are at the minute is that the EU holds up most of the cards for any negotiations that Britain wanders into. That's just always been the situation. So the amount of sort of noise and hassle and taking it to the wire, it's largely to the benefit of the government as a negotiating position rather more than it is the EU. And just one final thing, of course, at this point in time, the EU has and its governments have few incentives to bother about domestic consumption on any of this stuff. I mean, really, Brexit is quite low down on their list of concerns. For the British government, there is a very, very obvious domestic audience and the need to sell whatever they turn up with. So it's always in their interest to talk up no deal. That's something that might happen. It's always been everybody's interest to talk up no deal, regardless of how unlikely it really is. It was in Labour's interest last year to talk it up because it was a good way to stop everyone rowing amongst themselves and saying, yes, no deal is really bad. Do you see what I mean? So it's always in everybody's interest to talk up no deal far, far above the actual prospects of no deal happening.
So because it's being reported as a sport, we basically sort of see, Boris Johnson wants this, Ursula von der Leyen wants this, who's going to compromise first? And what I feel is discussed less is what are the actual implications of these. So as progressives, do we want a ratchet clause? Or do we want, whose side are we on here? I suppose is a very crude way of putting it. But what's the most progressive deal that could come out of these negotiations that's going to be announced in a week or two or whatever? And what's the one that we should be most worried about?
It's quite hard to get to a point that is uniquely progressive out of all of this. I mean, the basic problem is that any deal involves a certain amount of trade-offs in what you do and don't do. It would be nice to have the maximum possible freedom to intervene in the economy in any way you choose to see fit. That would be a nice thing to have. But to get that, you then also lose the ability to access without costs single market across the rest of Europe. So and that is a trade-off. That imposes real costs on what people do here, and there are economic consequences that follow from this. You then do the second round of it, which is go, well, that doesn't matter if, as the government was threatening or claiming it would do earlier in the week, if you just say, we'll just dish out money to everybody to compensate them for the fact that he is trying to impose these new costs. That's the kind of magic money trees being found, and you can use it to pay for the cost of a no-deal Brexit. Now, in reality, because the chances of a no-deal Brexit are small and probably getting smaller as the negotiations progress, that doesn't mean it won't happen. It's just if it does happen, it's the outcome no one wants. So it's the thing you trip into rather than you're actively seeking to get to at this point. That's the situation in the negotiations as they currently stand. The challenge for Britain in any setup here is that you can talk about it being a sport, but it's a sport where you approach this as Britain with if it's football, you've got 3 players and no goalie, and the other side have got 15 or 16 or 17 players and 3 goalkeepers, and then off you go trying to play football. It's that the negotiations have never taken place on the basis of an equal negotiation between parties. The EU holds most of the cards that Britain wants to get access to one way or the other. It is the single largest export market we have. It is determining most of what the rules and regulations in key industries like data in particular actually look like, and this determines in turn what our internal sort of economic structure starts to look like. Now, you can try and claim you're breaking through that, but it's actually rather difficult. What the ratchet clause implies, or anything like this implies, is that we end up with a relationship with Britain and the EU, which looks like the relationship Britain has always had with the EU, where successive British governments are trying to pull away and introduce fewer regulations, and this is imposing a bit of a push on the rest of Europe to try and reduce regulations, and then everything is a bit of a negotiation about how much you reduce regulations over time. So if you end up with a deal with the EU, it is kind of like the situation we've always been in, just a bit looser, maybe around the edges and around some things that most of the time you won't necessarily recognise, but in certain key aspects like freedom of movement will look rather different.
My final question is going back to the no-deal sports match, I'm afraid. And it is the one part of the debate I haven't quite understood myself, which is the thing I understand as to why why a deal seems overwhelmingly likely is because the decision is either face tariffs now or possibly face tariffs in the future for taking on some policy which is unyet specified. So why would you not put off that until some speculative future? The only other argument, but the argument that would, I suppose, override that would be, is there any way in which Britain has more leverage to get a better deal once it is out of the transition period? Would no deal leave us in a better position would that give us more bargaining chips, or is it the opposite?
It looks very much like the opposite. It's quite hard to see what you bring to the table if you've already gone through the process of leaving, which, yes, imposes a cost on Europe, but imposes a much heavier cost on the rest of us. I mean, we kind of, most of the real bargaining chips we might have here, we've already sort of said we're not going to use. You know, we're not actually going to threaten to tear up much of the security arrangements that you have with Europe. If you're not going to do that, because America doesn't want you to do that, then like a really big thing has already gone that you might have threatened. We're not going to do what Iceland did in the Cod Wars in the 70s, you know, which was fighting over fishing rights in waters near Iceland with Britain, which was threatened to leave NATO, chuck all the US troops out and close down the listening station that NATO had in Iceland to listen for Soviet troops. As soon as they threatened to do this, America leaned on Britain and said, you have to come to a deal with Iceland, and basically Iceland wins everything it wants because Britain folded immediately at that point. We don't have anything like that. I mean, we're not that concerned to defend our fish that we're going to threaten to leave NATO. So we don't have that much of a bargaining point. We don't have the City of London, really. There was a sort of prospect that you might be able to pull some of this out, but once everyone realised you're not going to get passporting rights, sort of full access rights to European markets, almost anything that happens to the city from that point onwards is so much worse than what it's got in the EU. It doesn't really matter that much if it's no deal or not. So your kind of bargaining ability there is looking a bit stuffed. So really nothing looks better once you've got to a no deal position. You just end up having to do a deal at some point in the future from a much worse position with a big economic shock in the interim. This doesn't look good. It's not something that a rational British government would want to go through. They might behave irrationally, it's possible, or things might just go wrong, or you know, they forget to post the note saying, here's our deal, and they don't remember to sign it, or some stupid thing like this. Accidents happen, but it has to be accidents, and it has to be quite a few accidents to actually get us to the point of no deal.
All this talk of, you know, threatening to leave NATO as a bargaining chip is making me really sad that there's not Seamus Milne and Jeremy Corbyn at the forefront of these negotiations. James Meadaway, it's been a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for filling us in on all the policy details that we just don't understand. I do now. So thank you for that.
No worries.
We're going to go to some super chats. We do appreciate all of those support. People are being very kind today. Joshua Clay Dennis with a tenner. Great work as always. Can you give a shout out to Coral, who's a recent convert to the show and a huge fan? Cell Biology Shorts. Love the name with a £5. Here's a cheeky Christmas bonus. And Phil Nicholson with a tenner. Happy holidays to all Novara, especially Michael and Tysky crew. Thank you so much. You have been a lifeline this year. I'm a sub, but here's a Christmas tip. Thank you so much. We do appreciate it. If you want to become a regular donor and you aren't already, please do go to novaramedia.com/support. We're going to go on to our next story. Yes. We are told Keir Starmer has completed unconscious bias training, but does he need lessons in identifying racism which is a little bit more explicit? That's the question I asked myself after watching him respond to a caller on LBC this morning. So the lady had phoned in to ask Keir Starmer what he thought about her husband, who she said had been one of the fans booing at Millwall's match when the players took a knee. Starmer said he disagreed with the booing, but then failed to challenge her on something she said which was far more worrying. Let's take a look.
Taking the knee, and the players and the referees very often take the knee, and I think that's what it's symbolic of.
I mean, even Les Ferdinand, who you'll probably know, just to remind my listeners, was a very successful footballer, happens to be a black fellow himself. He's now the first black man to be a director of football. He's with the Championship Queen's Park Rangers, and he says it is hollow. It's like a fancy hashtag or a lapel. It's his achieving nothing.
Well, I don't think that's right. What I think the
he's a black man who played football for England. I mean, he's in a position of knowledge, isn't he?
So he is, of course, and I respect his view, of course. It doesn't mean I agree with it. I think that what's happened over the many years, this is the counter-argument, it's quite a powerful one, is that there is racial inequality, there is injustice, and from time to time it becomes an issue, it's looked at for a few weeks, and then it goes away. And this is an attempt to keep the focus on it until things really change.
Hasn't the row now focused just on taking the knee? And the important issue of getting black managers, black directors of football, black chairmen or chairwomen of clubs. I mean, that's been lost because we just take the knee. So
No, I don't think it's one or the other. I think you can do both, and it's a way of drawing attention to it. But in the end, it's for each individual to decide how they want to tackle injustice.
Why did Gemma? Why did your husband? Sorry, you didn't quite explain. If I may go there again, why did he choose choose to boo? Sorry.
Because if anything, the racial inequality is now against the indigenous people of Britain, because we are set to become a minority by 2066. And taking the knee, bringing the political sphere into the football arena, and we just have to look across to the Middle East. You know, Israel has a state law, but they are the only people in that country to have self-determination. Well, why can't I, as a white British female, have that same right?
Final point to you on this, Sarkar.
But Gemma, we all have those rights. This is about recognising some injustice that's gone on for a very, very long time. And I think people were genuinely moved this year and want to make sure that that injustice is dealt with. And, you know, people will look at it different ways, but I think the vast majority of people do want a more equal society.
Gemma, thank you.
Now, I mean, I think actually Keir Starmer's answer in the first half of that clip was quite good. I think his defence of people taking a knee was very thoughtful and very persuasive. The second half, though, I mean, let's go over what that caller said. So the caller said that actually it's white people who are oppressed in this country because they're about to become a minority by 2066. Projections from some demographer, now that's sort of become core to the Great Replacement theory. I'm sure Ash will talk about that in more detail in a moment. What I want to focus on now, that the caller suggested we learn from the nation-state law in Israel and pass a law, which is basically saying let's pass a law guaranteeing self-determination for white Brits. So she's saying, why don't white Brits have the same right to self-determine that Jews in Israel do? And in response, Keir Starmer says, we all have those rights. No, we don't all have those rights. We don't all have the right to live in an ethno-state where our ethnicity is treated with as privileged over others. I mean, it's essentially apartheid, right? Now, obviously, I'm not saying that clip shows you that Keir Starmer supports apartheid, but I do think it is quite troubling that is essentially, I mean, that's how you can interpret his words. He didn't challenge that woman who said, let's have self-determination for white people in Britain like they have self-determination for Jews only in Israel. He sort of just brushed it off. Ash, I want to bring you in on this. Keir Starmer, he has done unconscious bias training, but either he didn't recognise what I thought was quite blatant white supremacy there, or he felt that it wasn't appropriate to challenge it.
Well, he should really be getting a refund on that unconscious bias training, shouldn't he? If you can't pick up on really obvious white nationalist conspiracism when it's right in front of you. And look, me and you have both done radio, phone and shows, and sometimes you don't get to say all the things that you want to say and you kick yourself a while after. But I don't think that's quite what happened here. I think what has happened here is that Keir Starmer was listening for what he knew to prepare for, which was the question on Millwall and booing and BLM and taking the knee. And it meant that he had just tuned out these, I mean, it's not even a racist dog whistle, right? It's an absolute honking white nationalist vuvuzela. And what that indicates to me is a certain lack of racial literacy, is what I would call it. A lack of racial literacy from Keir Starmer. And we've seen this, a couple of times before when he, called Black Lives Matter a moment and not a movement. When he, dismissed defunding the police out of hand, which is fine if that's a policy decision that you disagree with and want to distance yourself from. But with this kind of degree of disrespect for the activists who had generated it, he doesn't have that kind of discerning ear and ability to react and to respond from a place of, I think, very deep confidence and knowledge. And that's going to be a problem. And it's not going to be a problem because the left, who are phenomenally disempowered within Labour, are going to kick off. That's not going to be a thing that troubles him. What is going to trouble him is that this phenomenon of Great Replacement conspiracism and this kind of, subterranean media infrastructure, ecology, which is sort of being generated and nurtured by the alt-right, this kind of phoning into radio shows in order to wedge in your white nationalist talking points, that is only going to grow. And unless you have a Labour leader who's able to identify when this is going on and have some kind of prepared response to it, which is making, a real impassioned defense of the kind of society that he wants to see, a multiracial, multi-ethnic and multicultural democracy, then a Labour leader is not going to get anywhere nearer Downing Street than his predecessors, I think. And there's also one more thing that I briefly want to touch on, if that's okay, and it's about the matter of the Great Replacement itself. Because whenever I call the Great Replacement a conspiracy theory, I have 1,000,001 far-right thunderheads in my mentions, sharing this one clip from a video that I did a few years ago called Against Integration. And it's a 9-second clip in which I highlight some statistics which had been reported, I think, in the Daily Mail, indicating demographic change in London. And I go, all right, lads, we're winning. And the reason why they clip this and they distribute it is they think that it represents not only me saying, oh, the Great Replacement is real, but saying, and I'm a part of it, I endorse it, and I think it's really good. The actual much longer video is about the research produced by a sociologist called Ted Cantle. And I cite those statistics because I think that what it shows is that he handled this data in a very biased way. He looks at rising diversity, and because he judges it by the fact that you have a smaller proportion of white Brits in diverse areas, he goes, oh, that's a segregated neighborhood. I disagree with that fundamentally. The Great Replacement is a conspiracy theory which essentially says that there is a kind of shadowy, cabal of elites, often coded as Jewish. It's, very, very close to, lots of other anti-Semitic myths, this great replacement, that's pulling the strings to try and, eradicate, the indigenous white race from Europe and America and sometimes Australia. This is, of course, complete hokum. What they do is they take these statistics which show demographic change, and there's all kinds of demographic change, right? There's religious demographic change, there's racial demographic change, obviously. There's also age demographic change, which no one seems to have that big of a problem with. And they go, see, your race is under attack. No, what's going on and what drives these numbers is that, those waves of immigration, which were once kind of temporary, people would come over, they'd make some money, they'd move back. That's changed. People have settled down, they put down roots, they have children, they fall in love, they make lives with one another. They actually perform the kind of integration which everyone's telling me is the right thing to do. And that's what drives this Great Replacement conspiracy theory. It says that essentially demographic change is the result of these nefarious forces which are trying to rob white people of what's rightfully theirs. And it's very closely linked to anti-Semitism, also very, very closely linked with lots of really horrible stuff to do with, anti-abortion, very, very conservative on reproductive rights. And I think it's important that when this is going to be, I think, such a core part of the far right story going forward, and you can see that there is this porousness between the barrier between mainstream opinion and alt-right opinion because of the kind of huge electoral upsets of Donald Trump having won in the 2016 American election. You've also got hard right Brexit, you've got this current composition of Boris Johnson's cabinet, and then you've also got a media ecology which is constantly drawing on these figures and elevating them to pundit status. This is going to be something which is going to, I think, you'll hear about it more and more in our politics. And Keir Starmer, if he wants to, actually be a trusted figure on anti-racism, and I've got no doubt that that is something that he wants to do, if not always has the tools to be able to do, is going to have to work out a strategy for it, because tuning it out, responding to the question that you wanted to hear rather than the comments that you did actually hear, simply isn't good enough.
Say he wasn't listening actually gives him more credit than he deserves. I mean, he's an intelligent man. He was clearly listening to what was said, and he either didn't recognize that something drawn from white supremacy was said, or explicitly white supremacist was said, or he didn't feel comfortable challenging it. And one thing that I think actually stood out for me is that he clearly wasn't paying attention in the whole summer-long debate that we had about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Because if he had, he would know that one of the big problems with that, one of the big complaints people had, was that by saying that Israel has a right to self-determine, essentially, that can be used to justify the nation-state law, which is to say that if a people have a right to self-determination, then they have a right to be an ethnic majority in a nation, which is precisely what's motivating the nation-state law, which is to say that, yes, look, there's concerns in Israel that Arabs are reproduce it. I'm using their horrible language, that the Arab population is growing faster than the Jewish population. So to secure the rights of the Jewish population, you have to put basically a bit of an apartheid clause in the constitution to say, even if Jews no longer are the majority, they still are the only people with rights to have ownership of that nation, essentially. And this is being taken up by white supremacists in this country who are saying, look, there is a danger that whites will no longer be, or white people, sorry, I don't want to use that language. White people will no longer be the majority.
You sound like, de Klerk or something.
The whites. There's a danger the whites won't. There's a danger that white people will no longer be. There's a danger that white people will no longer be the majority in this country. So we have to have a constitutional solution, which is to, in the law, specify that this is a country for the whites. That's what the caller was suggesting. Because Keir Starmer wasn't paying attention to IRA, he wasn't paying attention to the nation-state law, he didn't notice that. I noticed that in like half a second, right? And that completely went over his head because he's not paying attention to liberation struggles around the world and the nature of ethno-nationalism is something that he's not alive to, and that means he completely missed the point there. I want to talk a bit more context for you, which is that thanks to researchers on Twitter, we know that the caller was not actually Gemma from Cambridge, as she claimed, but someone who goes by the name of Jodie Kay. So she has a YouTube channel promoting far-right conspiracy theories and is a supporter of the far-right patriotic alternative group. Apparently she was introduced as Gemma from Cambridge, as I said, but she is in fact a yoga teacher in Ibiza. The far-right were also pleased with how it went. So this is a screenshot from a far-right Telegram broadcast. It was found by the crowdsourcing collective Red Flare on Twitter, definitely worth a follow. And you can see there, this is a far-right account, Charlie Big Potatoes Official. I don't know where the name comes from. They say an absolute masterclass of grouping, which is to say you go on sort of mainstream platforms and put in conspiracy theories sort of unbeknownst to the host. From Jodie Kay here, as all Keir Starmer can do is try and worm his way out of answering any of her points. Well done, Jodie. Now, obviously, they're being completely opportunistic. They're claiming this is a victory because it makes them look good. But it's undeniable that Keir Starmer didn't successfully challenge. And in fact, by saying we all have those rights, in a way, by accident, I'm sure by accident, reinforced and legitimised the quite horrific views which were being put to him. We're going to go to a couple of super chats. So we have Wagtail tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour. Keith Probst didn't notice the honking vuvuzela of racism because he was sitting so close to the odious Mr. F. I presume that refers to Nick Ferrari, who, as we have spoken about, just last week, spoke about how there were going to be Jamaican rapists coming to your street. He's also told Afua Hirsch, a woman of colour who was born in Britain, that if she has a problem with Britain, why does she live here? So this is someone with a real history of racism. I don't think that doesn't mean that, people say that means that Keir Starmer shouldn't go on the show. I personally think, I don't have a problem with him going on the show, but I do think he should be alert to white supremacy when he does and willing to challenge it when he hears it, which quite clearly he's not. Mike John Jean 17 with a tenor. That Starmer moment reminded me of Bush when told about the Twin Towers attack. He stood there like a dummy. The response was odd, wasn't it? Thomas Lycett, I was actually reminded of this. Keir Starmer sacked RLB, Rebecca Long-Bailey, for not noticing an inaccuracy about Israel in an article. Surely not noticing a white supremacist conspiracy theory about Israel is a much worse offence. Harkrit Boparai with a tenor. First time super chat, thank you very much. Big fan. Can we get coverage of farmers' protests in India? Punjabi farmers marching against new laws favouring corporations. Now a general strike, one of the biggest in world history. Now, we did actually cover that last week, I think on Wednesday. So you can go back to Wednesday's show and have a look at that. And we are also going to have further coverage of those protests on novaramedia.com this week. That will be in our articles section, which I advise all of you to check out. We have so many really, really interesting articles going out at the moment. So do check out that part of our page. Next story. We don't normally like to obsess about Twitter rows, as they can all seem a little bit parochial, but every now and again, something blows up and develops in such a way that tells us so much about Britain's establishment that we have to talk about it. We have to cover it on Tysky Sour. Now, this happened on Sunday. It concerned Sunday Times and Spectator columnist Rod Liddle. And then it also concerns Sunday Telegraph columnist Julie Burchill, but we'll get to that in one moment. First of all, this is the piece from Rod Liddle, which resurfaced on the site. It's from 2012, but as often happened, it went viral this weekend. You can see a teenage girl, a maths teacher, and a righteous tabloid fury. Now, this piece is about the 30-year-old maths teacher who fled to France with his 15-year-old student. He was in a relationship with her. He was ultimately jailed for abduction. And in the piece, Liddle mentions that he did at one point consider becoming a teacher. So Rod Liddle in this piece is sort of saying everyone's being very hysterical about this case. Yes, he was a 30-year-old teacher that went away with his student. And yes, there's some problems with that. But also, are we overreacting? And to explain why we might be overreacting, he explained why he didn't become a teacher, even though he pondered it. So he wrote, I never found out because the one thing stopping me from being a teacher was that I could not remotely conceive of not trying to shag the kids. It seemed to me virtually impossible not to, and I was convinced that I'd be right in there on day one. We're talking secondary school level here, by the way, and even then I don't think I'd have dabbled much below year 10 as it is now called. I just thought we ought to clear that up early on. Now, this is pretty fucking weird. I mean, you might say it's from 2012. Why are you bringing this up from 2012? I mean, I think when you have prominent people in public life, it is always reasonable to look at what they've said in the past. And Rod Liddle says, I mean, offensive things every week. So he's someone with a history of this and with a present life of this as well. He is currently a columnist at the Sunday Times and associate editor at The Spectator. He also was a former editor at the Today programme. So it's slightly weird that he was talking about shagging kids in The Spectator only a few years ago. But to take you to the development in the Twitter row, this is because Ash tweeted that little piece yesterday. It's sort of gone viral with screenshots. She tweeted it afterwards. And then there was sort of a horrific attack from another broadsheet columnist on Ash using far-right Islamophobia. Let's start by going to the tweet from Ash. So in reply to someone commenting on Ash's tweet, you replied, also, when he writes that he wouldn't have dabbled much below year 10, that's referring to 14 and 15-year-olds. That's still child sexual abuse, and it's astonishing that both he and his editor thought guffawing about hypothetically being a paedophile made for a good article. Now, this tweet grabs the attention of Sunday Telegraph columnist Julie Burchill. So she says, IOCs at Ash, can you please remind me of the age of the Prophet Muhammad's first wife? Thank you in anticipation. Now, I imagine most of our audience will be able to see instantly why that's Islamophobic. But if you don't, what Julie Burchill has done there is she has seen someone who she knows to be a Muslim journalist who is calling someone out for supporting child sexual abuse and then saying, well, you think you can oppose child sexual abuse? Well, you're a Muslim, so therefore you should answer for Muhammad because he was a pedo. This is really standard Tommy Robinson style racism. Ash, I'm going to bring you in. I can only start by saying, solidarity for being subjected to that racist abuse from a broadsheet columnist at the Sunday Telegraph. But I mean, what did you make of this? I suppose talk about what you understand is going on here.
I mean, like you said, it's really classic far-right Islamophobia of trying to make this association between being a Muslim and some kind of either tacit support for child sexual abuse or even explicit support for it. When she talked about the Prophet Muhammad's first wife, she was, of course, incorrect. The Prophet Muhammad's first wife, Khadija, was older than him. Some accounts have her in her 40s. She was the one who proposed to him. She was a very successful merchant, more educated than him, and a widow when the two of them met. So she didn't even get her, far-right talking point correct. She was referring to Aisha, who was a later wife of the Prophet. And there is differences amongst Islamic scholars about how old Aisha was said to be. Now, in Islamic law, which I'm not going to pretend I'm any great or a special expert on, I'm not a student of the scriptures, but in Islamic law, marriage is only lawful if it's between two consenting adults. And at this time, the Prophet Muhammad was alive. Someone who wanted to marry had to have gone through puberty. So there were also betrothals earlier, but for a marriage to be lawful, for a marriage to be consummated, a young woman would have had to have gone through that process. So we're talking about a time where there weren't birth records of when people were born. So there are differences amongst Islamic scholars who place her between the ages of 9 and 19 when she, got married to the Prophet Muhammad. Obviously, even those later years are still very, very young to modernize, and I'm really glad that child marriage isn't a normal thing in our society anymore. But that's just the sort of context. But I don't think that Julie Burchill was bringing this up because she has an special or deep interest in what I happen to think about Islamic theology. She'd probably, hit the floor of that knowledge very, very quickly. But she's not especially interested in that. What this was about, I think, was discrediting my voice in this conversation purely because I'm Muslim. She has a bit of a habit of this before. She tweeted at me, I think perhaps a week previously, asking if I'd changed my bio because I'd been threatened by my co-religionists. Again, this is a very strange interest in my faith and whether or not I'm sort of subject to, the horrible oppressive behaviors of men because of it. Just FYI, the reason why I changed my bio from fucks like a champion to kebab aficionado is because, I'm getting closer to 30, man, and it ain't cute. That's the only reason. It's not because I was subject to a fatwa or I was going to be cast out of my family or anything like that. I know this isn't something which people like Julie Burchill like to think, but all the Muslims I'm related to in my family are socialists. They're feminists. They're also feminists who don't define themselves by being hateful to trans people as well. And when it comes to matters of sex and sexuality, they are a million times more progressive than some bigot who hasn't been swept out with the rest of the trash from the long 90s.
That was a very good description there. As you say, she seems to have been obsessed with you for a while, and also your Muslim background. She has, surprise, also, before she deleted her Twitter account, which she did eventually, apparently on the orders of her publisher, used the controversy to try and sell her book, which is about, you can guess it, it's about wokeness. So her book is called Welcome to the Woke Trials, How We Can Shape Progressive Future Politics. Now, I don't know what she thinks she has to do with progressive future politics, given that she's quite clearly Islamophobic, but all incredibly bizarre. Now, I mean, Ash, I just want you to talk a bit about what you think this says about our mainstream press. Obviously, the two people we have spoken about in this piece, Rod Liddle, a columnist for the Sunday Times, Julie Burchill, a columnist for the Sunday Telegraph, one of them sort of suggesting the reason he didn't become a teacher was because he would have shagged the kids. That ended up getting published in The Spectator. Now you've got Julie Burchill, who is very clearly targeting a journalist because of her Muslim faith and saying she has no right to talk about child abuse. Classic Tommy Robinson style far-right Islamophobia. What does it tell you that these are people who still have, very highly coveted positions in mainstream British life?
Well, tell you what, I'm not going to name any names because it would be unfair. But there is a certain strata of British opinion writers who are notorious for sloppy copy, riddled with errors, filed late, unimaginative, dull, occasionally, deliberately offensive, and that stirs up some kind of, reputation for being provocative. And they enjoy relatively well-paid, secure jobs because, one, they've been in the industry for a very, very long time, and it's kind of sunk costs fallacy. Once you've been in the in crowd for a certain period of time, it's hard to get you out again. And then the second thing is because the way in which the world of media and journalism works is that the more embedded you get in these social networks and these friendships and these kinds of almost, chains and connections of patronage, the less you will be held accountable for either the shortcomings in your work or, the hateful way in which you may conduct yourself to other people. So I think that it's a real problem of British media, its clubbiness and its chumminess. And then you've got the political problems here. One is that we very clearly have a hierarchy of bigotries in this country. I don't think that had the same things been said by, say, a left-wing columnist, say Owen Jones, on Twitter, targeting somebody for presumptions he'd made about their Jewish faith, that he would still enjoy a job with The Guardian. I don't think that would be the case. And that's because of the way in which, certain forms of racism have been taken more seriously, not because there's any real care for the pain of the Jewish community, but because it's a stick with which you can beat the left. And it also means that you don't pay much attention to anti-Semitism that comes from the right. So you've got a hierarchy of racism, which sort of says that some kinds are more important to act on if you want to, drum somebody out of public life, and some forms are much less important. And Islamophobia is way down there, rattling around the doldrums, along with, bigotry and hatred against the Gypsy, Roma, and traveler community, and transphobia, because we're a group of people who've been so utterly dehumanized, and that dehumanization has resulted in foreign policy decisions like the invasion of Iraq, the, implementation of domestic terror policy, which had terribly discriminatory effects, what absolute outrages against civil liberties. But because that was driven by this dehumanization, again, that's another thing which keeps that hierarchy of racism going. So it's not just about, well, here's something being taken more seriously. It's also about a real entrenched pattern of dehumanization and the dismissal of Muslim concerns. And I think that explains why there were relatively few of, the kind of entrenched columnist brigade who were calling this out. I was very appreciative of Jess Brammer from Huffington Post, Mehdi Hassan. I was very pleased to see supportive tweets from Angela Rayner as well. But there were certainly people who follow Julie Burchill, and I noticed on her followers list, who had absolutely nothing to say. Suzanne Moore, who was pictured in her Twitter header, for instance, who has been very outspoken on the issue of anti-Semitism. And, if anti-racism is very dear to your politics, it's important to articulate that. But again, nothing to say. So why is that? Why is that? Is it because I particularly deserve to be treated in this way? Is it because there's something objectively correct in treating Muslims this way, only seeing them through the lens of your most warped and bigoted assumptions about their faith? I don't know. What is it?
I think it's a combination of all of those things, and it's disgusting. Solidarity, again, it's so horrible to be targeted because of your ethnic background or your faith, and that is what people who have columns in mainstream British newspapers did yesterday. And as far as I can see, it doesn't seem like it's going to come with any consequences. Really, really rank. Let's go to our final story. Before we do that, if you're enjoying the show, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button. So you can see us whenever we go live on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. And then we've got loads of other videos going out during the week. Jeremy Corbyn has had a difficult time of late. He was suspended from the Labour Party, then readmitted to the Labour Party, then had the Labour whip withdrawn. But while Starmer is keen to make Labour a hostile environment for the former leader, one new organisation has launched which is beyond Sir Keir's control.
Today, I'm announcing a new project for the new year. I'm very excited about it, and I hope you will be too. Next month, we're kicking off the Peace and Justice Project. We're going to bring people together. It's been a difficult year for all of us. The coronavirus pandemic has exposed and deepened the scale of injustice and inequality in our society. Its mishandling and devastating human consequences have shown the inability of our privatised, hollowed-out systems to meet the challenges of our time. The Black Lives Matters movement has fueled a global response to the scourge of racism. Wildfires across Australia, Russia, and the United States have driven home the fact that none of us are safe from the climate crisis.
I loved the aesthetic of that video, I have to say. Very old school. Thought the suit looked very nice. I mean, it's nice, I think, just to see Jeremy Corbyn liberated from the shackles of the Labour Party. Obviously, he's still a Labour member, and I hope he gets back the Labour whip. But it seems positive to me to have this project where he can go, I suppose, almost back to what traditionally Jeremy Corbyn did do, which was sort of give voice to, fight for causes which are often ignored in the mainstream press, ignored by major parties precisely because they weren't the kind of causes that win you elections. Talking about, he'd be the one person who was advocating for the people of the Chagos Islands, for example, the one person advocating for the people of Kurdistan. And now I feel like this is potentially a place where he can do that again. Ash, what do you make of it?
I mean, so I think that, Jeremy Corbyn vis-a-vis Keir Starmer is in a very disempowered position. When it comes to the left more generally, still in a very strong position. So setting up a new organisation, which can be a kind of, totemic, organising centre of gravity for the left is potentially very powerful at a time where they can't feel their politics being adequately represented or acted upon by the current Labour Party leadership. The second thing is that when you look at the kinds of social movements that he's referencing with regards to, the movement against climate change, Black Lives Matter, is that this is a kind of constellation of interests and values which really animate those younger voters, those, long-time leftists and trade union activists who kind of made up those two wings of his core, the kinds of, the young and the old pincer movement there. And so I think that those two things could be potentially very positive. What I would say, because we were very nice about that aesthetic, Michael. You were very, very nice about it. But I think that the presentation of that video was a real shame. And I'm not just saying that about, being shallow or snarky or anything like that. The reason why I'm saying that is because it's a missed opportunity. When you've got Jeremy Corbyn, who has been dragged through it for the last 2 months, he's only been seen in relation to very, very hostile headlines, very, very negative coverage, to then depict him in this kind of strange dentist waiting room studio is to almost emphasize his isolation, his cut-offness from everybody else. Whereas the one thing I think everyone can agree on about Jeremy Corbyn, both his supporters and his detractors, is that he felt most at home in and amongst people, organising, working with people, being out there on the march, that kind of thing. A much more, I think, powerful presentation would have been a very simple voiceover on top of footage of him connecting with people. That was always something that he could do very well. I'll never forget when he visited Grenfell shortly after the fire, after Theresa May had gone, flanked by police and separate from everybody else. Jeremy Corbyn got in there and he hugged people and he comforted people and he listened to people. And that's the kind of Corbyn that he would need to remind the public of should he want his project to be a success. So this weird kind of, Maury Povich, Dr. Phil backdrop isn't going to do it.
It's like a 90s televangelist. What I like about it, because I see where you're coming from, but at the same time, I quite like that he's liberated from having to be constantly strategic. I mean, what we know about Jeremy Corbyn was, he has an encyclopedic knowledge of global struggles. He's very passionate about, international solidarity, but the constant demand of him to be sort of this strategic being who spoke to the majority of the public obviously had a huge strain on him, and now he's making this sort of this kind of more niche. It can speak sort of really to 10 to 20% of the population, but he doesn't have to worry about swing voters anymore. He can just be like, I'm me, I'm here, I'm like a televangelist, I'm going to speak to all of the people struggling around the world. He seems so natural there.
If he wants to be niche, he wants to focus full time on his career as an experimental ambient DJ, fine. Yeah, but if essentially what you're saying is that you are still going to be some kind of, leader or organizer or, prominent person amongst the left, then yes, you do have to be strategic. I'm not talking about electoral triangulation or anything like that. I'm talking about being effective and communicating in a way which meets also the fact that his base have been, traduced and demoralized for the last year and lifts them up a bit. And aesthetics are important for doing that. How you present yourself, how you talk, being able to communicate a sense of passion or optimism, hope. That's important. So I'm not letting him get off being idiosyncratic and weird. And he's obviously a very, very idiosyncratic guy. I've always found it funny that people considered him like anti-Britain, anti-English, when no other country on earth could have produced him. This kind of, allotment wanderer. But if you're going to, make a case that you should retain a position of leadership on the left, especially after this past year, you have to be shit hot.
Let's have a look at how the project describes itself. So we're told that we're going to learn more when it properly launches in January. But on the website, they have a mission statement. It says the Peace and Justice Project will back, or I'll start from to bring together. To bring people together for social and economic justice, peace and human rights in Britain and across the world. The Peace and Justice Project will back campaigns, commission reports and develop progressive networks in Britain and across the world. The Peace and Justice Project will work with labour and social movements and provide platforms to those campaigning for change for the many, not the few. And then on the What We Do section, it says, change is a process with many components. We bring together academics and researchers, leaders and campaigners, and grassroots people and organisations to highlight injustices and solve problems together. We take a holistic view of justice and work mainly on the following themes. And then those following themes are poverty, inequality and corporate power, global cooperation, international global cooperation and international peace, colonialism, self-determination, democracy and independence, and climate justice. It is also important to note this isn't, some people on Twitter have been suggesting, is this going to be the groundwork for a new political party? No, sources close to Corbyn have very much denied that. And also, from people who know what he's about, that seems quite unlikely. I think this is very much what it says on the tin. Which is somewhere, it seems to me, to sort of share ideas, to be a bit of a focal point for organising. I doubt it's going to be I assume this won't concern itself with internal organising in the Labour Party. There's an organisation called Momentum which can do that. I think this is going to be, as I say, sort of liberating him to be sort of idiosyncratic representative of oppressed and forgotten people that he always has been. Maybe we'll just have to agree to disagree on the aesthetic, Ash. Luckily, we've never had beef in the Novara media organisation as to whether or not we should look like a televangelist from the 90s. But in this case, I think
because generally our aesthetics are very similar. Look at us, wearing black. We like a bit of sportswear.
Yeah, but Corbyn isn't. Jeremy Corbyn's very different. He's different but special. And we should let him express himself.
He's not a televangelist either. That's not like, I'm going back to, preaching those, those warehouse churches that you get, particularly like around Tottenham and then Southeast London. That wasn't his thing, man. That wasn't his thing. Whereas you do actually have loads of like really brilliant footage of him connecting with people. They should have just done a super cut of that, voiceover, job done, bish bash bosh. I'm not angling for a job here. This advice is free. Someone get this to Jezza. Put it on a VHS and post it to him if you have to. But get him this advice. The aesthetic needs to change. Look sharp.
All right, we need more advice from you, Ash. One question from Half Price of a £5. Question for Ash Kebab aficionado. Doner, shish or kofta? Also, which sauce goes with what meat in your choice? Asking for a friend.
Ooh, okay, all right. So my favorite order is Adana kebab, which is the squished together spiced lamb meat on the skewer, and it's got lots of chili in it, and there's also got extra chopped up tail fat in it, so it's just super duper moist.
I think that's what's often called kofta, isn't it? Isn't that the same as a kofta?
I know it is Adana because I grew up in a very, very Turkish area.
Yeah.
So that's what I know as Adana kebab, and you have to like squish it on in a particular way with wet hands. Super duper difficult. And when you say which sauce, there's only one correct answer to the sauce. And when boss man says to you garlic or chili, you say both. There's no other correct answer. Oh, there's also sometimes the meat sauce. The meat sauce you get at sorry, this is super duper London centric. I'm so sorry, but at FM Mangal in Camberwell. They do this sauce with the bread with like kind of an onion or shallot in it. It's like vinegary and meat juice. And oh, yeah. I'd go swimming in that if I could.
Scumbag producer Fox just said burger sauce. So you can tell what kind of kebab shops he goes to. They're probably very different to the ones at Celadana Kebabs.
Burger sauce.
Burger sauce, yeah. We should wrap up there on that note. Thank you for your super chats this evening. And thank you for your comments, your tweets. We have enjoyed them very much. We will be back on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Ash Sarkar, it's been an absolute pleasure as always.
It's been nice being here, man. I said I didn't want to be here. I was just lying, trying to keep you keen, treat you a bit mean.
It works. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.